Every year, around my birthday, I make it a point to go camping on Lake Superior by myself. It's become a kind of tradition over the last couple of years, something I look forward to. I love the solitude, the peace, and the chance to just be by myself for a while. There's something about the ruggedness of the area that clears my head, away from the noise of everyday life. The sounds of the wind and the water hitting the shore are the only background noise, and I can almost feel the weight of my thoughts lifting as I sit on the rocky shore, watching the waves roll in. This particular trip had been like every other. I spent the day hiking along the shore, exploring the trails that wound through the trees. The weather had been perfect for it, cool but not cold, with clear skies and a light breeze. The sun began to set as I found a good spot for my hammock. It was tucked into a small clearing with just enough space to stretch out and still have a great view of the water through the trees. I set up my hammock quickly, as I had done so many times before. I'd always preferred the hammock to a tent. It felt more natural, like being part of the forest, rather than separated from it. I strung it between two sturdy trees, making sure everything was secure. The underquilt went underneath to keep me warm, and my sleeping bag was carefully tucked inside. By the time I climbed in and settled down, the sun had disappeared below the horizon, leaving the sky painted in shades of purple and orange. I leaned back in the hammock, closed my eyes for a moment, and just listened to the sounds of nature around me. It was quiet, eerily quiet, except for the occasional call of a bird or the rustling of leaves. But it didn't feel unsettling. I had camped here enough times to know that the woods were safe, even if it sometimes felt a little too quiet. I had a small lantern hanging nearby to give me just enough light to see my surroundings, but I didn't need much. It wasn't long before I felt myself beginning to doze off. That's when it happened. A cold, blunt object pressed against my butt, poking through the underquilt. It wasn't sharp, but it was firm and definitely not something I expected. It wasn't an animal sniffing around, either. It felt deliberate, like something was pushing into me from behind. My eyes shot open, and my heart started pounding. I froze, barely daring to move. I was immediately alert, adrenaline shooting through my veins. I had no idea what it could be. I had set up my camp in a fairly remote area, but I'd still seen a few people on the trail earlier. Maybe it was one of them trying to prank me, but that didn't make sense either, especially given how far back I was from the main trail. And besides, I hadn't heard anyone approach. The worst part was the silence that followed. I didn't hear any scrambling in the brush, no rustling of leaves, no footsteps. Whatever had poked me was still there, and it wasn't moving. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. What kind of animal would get so close without making a sound? And why wouldn't it move away after I jumped like that? I reached for my lantern, trying to stay as still as possible. My breath was shallow, my skin tingling with a cold sweat. I flicked the switch, and the light illuminated the trees around me, casting long shadows. Nothing. Just the rustling of leaves in the wind. My lantern swayed gently in the breeze, but that was it. No sign of anything unusual. No movement, no animal, nothing. I waited, listening hard. I could hear the faint sound of the waves crashing on the shore, but otherwise it was eerily still. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a fox or some other small animal investigating my hammock. I had heard about animals like that before, curious but cautious. But still, I didn't hear the scurry of paws or any of the usual sounds of animals moving through the underbrush. My mind kept returning to the feeling of that cold, blunt object pressing against me. It didn't feel like an animal. It felt too deliberate. It was as if someone or something was trying to get my attention. I could feel my muscles tensing, my thoughts racing. I decided to give it a few more minutes. If there was an animal, it would move on. It always did. I kept my eyes fixed on the trees in front of me, but everything stayed still. The silence felt unnatural now, like the whole forest was holding its breath. I finally summoned the courage to sit up and scan the area around me. My lantern cast weak light into the trees, but there was nothing to be seen. The woods were empty, and the trail to my left was just as silent as it had been when I first arrived. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable before. I didn't want to believe that it was something sinister. I told myself it was just a fox or a raccoon, maybe even the wind pushing something against me. But deep down, I knew it didn't feel like any of those things. It felt like someone, or something, had been standing right behind me. I sat there for a while, my back stiff with tension. Every rustle in the trees made my heart skip a beat. After what felt like an eternity, I decided to take a quick walk to clear my head. Maybe a change of scenery would help. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the hammock, my feet crunching softly on the forest floor. I moved cautiously, listening to the sounds of the night around me. The wind was picking up, but otherwise, everything seemed normal. As I walked, I tried to shake the unease that had settled in my stomach. It had been a strange feeling, but I didn't want to let my mind run away with me. Could have been anything, I kept telling myself. Just a weird moment. But as I walked deeper into the woods, I noticed something. It wasn't the usual sights or sounds that I had grown familiar with over the years. There were footprints, fresh ones, leading into the underbrush. They weren't animal tracks. They were too wide, too deliberate. Human tracks. My blood ran cold. My heart started racing again. No one else had been around, or at least no one I had seen. I froze in place, the flashlight trembling in my hand as I scanned the area. The tracks were clear, footprints in the soft ground, leading away from my hammock and toward a small cluster of trees. There was no way anyone else could have known I was there. It was too remote. I hadn't seen another soul all day. My mind went back to the feeling of the cold object pressing against me. Whoever had made those tracks might have been standing behind me. I took a step back, then another. My mind was racing, trying to think of a reasonable explanation, but all I could think of was that I wasn't alone. With my heart pounding in my chest, I made my way back to the hammock, my senses on high alert. I didn't know who, if anyone, was out there. I didn't want to stick around long enough to find out. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept my eyes on the trees, my ears straining for any sign of movement. The wind howled through the branches, but the silence between the gusts was deafening. Every small noise made my heart skip. I kept telling myself that it was nothing, that I was just being paranoid, but the feeling didn't go away. The tracks, the poke in my back, it didn't add up. By morning, I was packed up and ready to leave. The sky was gray, the air crisp, but I couldn't shake the unease that had settled deep in my bones. I couldn't explain what happened that night, and I didn't want to try. I haven't been back to that spot since. Every time I think about it, that feeling creeps back into my chest, tight and uncomfortable. It wasn't the kind of thing you could easily explain away. It was just a feeling something wasn't right. And sometimes, that's all it takes to make you second-guess everything you thought you knew about being alone in the woods. I still camp on Lake Superior, but I stick to more crowded areas now. I don't camp alone in places that feel too quiet, too remote anymore. And I always make sure I'm aware of the silence around me. Because sometimes, silence can be more unsettling than any noise. It was 4 years ago when my friends and I decided to take a hike in the foothills. We'd been planning it for a while, and it was supposed to be an easy, fun trip. Nothing too serious, just a quick getaway into the woods. We had everything packed, ready to go, and the first few miles felt amazing. The weather was perfect, the air was fresh, and we were joking around, making our way up the trails. We hit Table Rock in the afternoon, and that's when things started to change. Out of nowhere, the sky darkened, and a storm started rolling in. The weather in the foothills can turn on you fast, and that's exactly what happened. 1 minute, the sun was shining. The next, we were hit by a downpour that came out of nowhere, soaking us almost immediately. We weren't too concerned at first. We had planned for this kind of thing, and it wasn't like we didn't have shelter. We found a small patch of trees and set up a tarp to huddle under. Everyone got their snacks out and we sat there, laughing at the absurdity of it all. It was still early in the afternoon, and we had a whole other day planned for the goof-off portion of the trip. So we figured we'd wait out the storm, dry off a bit, and then continue on. The rain didn't let up. In fact, it only got worse. We decided it was probably best to set up camp early and ride out the storm in our tents. We set everything up under the trees, a little bit off the trail, and settled in for what we thought was going to be a cozy night. The tents were small but comfortable enough, and it wasn't cold, so we didn't have to worry too much about the weather. After we were all in our tents, we realized it wasn't as fun as we thought it would be. The rain started pounding even harder, and the constant sound of it hitting the rainfly made it feel like we were in a drum. I wasn't tired yet, though, so I decided to smoke. I didn't want to sleep right away, so I pulled out my joint and lit it up, letting the smoke drift out into the wet night air. The rain drowned out almost everything else, and it felt like the world had shrunk down to just me, my friends, and the sound of the storm. I wasn't sure if I drifted off because of the smoke or just from sheer boredom, but I eventually fell asleep. I didn't sleep long, though. At about 3 a.m., I was yanked awake by the sound of frantic shaking. My heart jumped, and I sat up, disoriented. The only thing I could hear over the rain was my buddy's wife, Condor, shouting something through the thin fabric of the tent. "Get up! Something's attacking the tent." I blinked in confusion, trying to make sense of the situation. It was still pouring rain, and all I could think about was getting back to sleep. But Condor's voice was panicked now, and that got my attention. I pulled myself out of my sleeping bag, fumbling around in the darkness to get dressed in the damp clothes I had left by my tent door. It was the kind of cold that went straight to your bones, and the last thing I wanted was to be outside in the rain for any longer than I had to be. When I finally opened the door to my tent, I saw the rest of the group already outside, looking anxious. Condor was standing there, holding a flashlight and pointing toward the other tent. I could see her shaking, though it wasn't from the cold. "Some animal is under there," she said. "It's trying to get in." I was half awake and barely processing the situation, but I could hear something scratching at the rainfly of the tent. It was too loud to ignore, and as I stepped closer, I saw the silhouette of a creature moving around under the tarp. I didn't think much of it at first, just hoping it was some raccoon or another harmless animal. I grabbed a long stick that was lying on the ground and tried to shove it toward the source of the noise. We had to move quickly. No one wanted to get too close to the tent, not knowing what was under there. It took a few moments before the truth hit us. The animal wasn't just scurrying around or poking through the rainfly, it was chewing through it. A skunk, of course. It had crawled under the rainfly and was chewing through the fabric of their tent, right where my buddy's socks were hanging up to dry. It was like it had a mission. It wasn't just trying to get in, it was after something specific. At first, we were all frozen, not wanting to escalate things. A skunk spraying you in the middle of the night would have ruined the trip for all of us. We stood there, trying to think of what to do, but I had a feeling the situation was going to get out of hand if we didn't act fast. The first attempt at getting rid of the skunk was simple enough. I waved the stick at it, trying to make noise and scare it off. It didn't even flinch. It just kept gnawing at the tent, now pulling at the fabric like it was hungry. The more we tried to shoo it, the more aggressive it seemed to get. After a few minutes, I realized that this wasn't going to be as easy as I thought. We had no choice but to take shifts. One person would try to fight the skunk off, while the others packed up their gear as quickly as possible. If that skunk decided to spray us, it was over for the whole trip. We couldn't risk it, so we spent hours running around in the rain, slapping the skunk away with sticks, rocks, and anything we could find. At some point, our methods started getting more drastic. We threw everything we had at it. Logs, branches, even a rock that was probably too big to throw. Nothing worked. The skunk wasn't scared, wasn't backing down. It didn't care that we were there. It was fixated on the socks. Every time we thought we'd scared it away, it would come right back, relentless. We had to stay on our toes, and I'm sure I wasn't the only one getting frustrated. Eventually, I took a large branch, hooked it under the skunk, and threw it. It soared about 30 feet into the woods. For a second, I thought it was over, but no, the skunk came right back. I hit it with a huge rock, and for a moment it stopped. It didn't retreat, but it paused, just long enough for us to regroup. After about 2 hours of this, the rain had slowed down enough that we could start packing up properly. We were all soaked through, exhausted, and honestly, I was starting to feel like we were dealing with a zombie animal. The skunk never gave up, but in the end, we got our stuff packed and started moving. We left the site at around 5 a.m. Still soaked, still tired, and I was still naked under my rain suit, but we were out of there. We walked until the rain stopped completely, pushing on until we reached the original campsite we had planned for our goof-off day. That first day, we couldn't really do much other than lay around, too tired and drenched to do anything. But the storm had passed, the skies cleared, and the rest of the trip turned out perfect. The weather was calm, the sun came out, and we got everything dried off. Felt like the real trip had just started after that damn skunk. That damn zombie skunk, I swear it had rabies. It never stopped. But after all that chaos, the rest of the trip was the kind of experience we were hoping for. The woods were peaceful, we got the laughs we were craving, and even though we couldn't get the skunk incident out of our minds, we knew we'd be talking about it for a long time. And that's how it went. The storm ended, the trip went on, and we finally got to relax. We didn't let the skunk ruin it. We had a good time after all, and it turned out to be one of those stories we'd all tell for years. Still, I'll never forget that relentless, soaking wet little creature that kept coming back, no matter what we threw at it. No ghosts, no fairy tale nonsense, just a night in the woods that turned into a test of patience and determination. Years ago, I went camping with my girlfriend, Emily, and another couple, Dawn and Sarah. We had all been friends for a long time, but this camping trip was something different. It wasn't one of those typical campground trips where you have neighbors and park rangers nearby. No, this was a deep in the woods, off the beaten path kind of trip. We were miles away from civilization, in a spot that only a few people knew about. The kind of place where the only sound at night is the rustling of trees and the occasional owl. We had a long day of hiking, setting up camp, and cooking over a fire. The night fell quickly, and we sat around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and talking about old memories. But as the hours passed and the fire died down to glowing embers, a weird feeling started creeping over me. Something felt off. Maybe it was the isolation, or maybe it was the fact that we hadn't seen a soul all day. It was just us in the woods, and the silence was heavy. But we all went to our tents without much thought, exhausted from the hike. That first night, I was lying in my sleeping bag, trying to get some rest. The air outside was cool, and the ground was hard, but I was too tired to care. At some point, I began to smell something faint. It was a very distinct odor, cigarette smoke. I figured maybe Don had snuck one after quitting a few months ago, but I didn't want to accuse him of it. I rolled over and tried to sleep, but the smell kept lingering, faint but there. It was odd. I had never known Don to sneak smokes, especially after he'd quit. So, I shrugged it off and eventually dozed off. The next morning, the sun barely crept over the horizon. We were all sluggish from the night before, but we got up and made breakfast. I decided to ask Don about the cigarette smell from the night before. We stepped away from the others, both of us walking toward the trees a little distance away. I casually asked, "Hey man, you sneak a smoke last night?" He looked at me confused and shook his head.
No.
I haven't smoked in months. I didn't even bring any with me. He seemed genuinely puzzled. I thought maybe I was just imagining it, or maybe the wind had carried it from somewhere else. It didn't make sense, but I let it go for the moment. The rest of the day was uneventful. We hiked around, explored some nearby streams, and just enjoyed the isolation. But when night fell, something felt off again. That second night, the smell of cigarette smoke returned, but this time it was stronger. It was enough to keep me awake. It didn't smell like it was inside the tent, but it was close, a little too close. I could tell it wasn't just the wind bringing it in from the campfire either. The breeze was coming from the opposite direction. This time, I decided I wasn't going to just ignore it. I quietly unzipped the tent, careful not to wake Emily or the others, and stepped out into the darkness. The forest was pitch black, the only light coming from the dim glow of the fire behind me. I stood still for a moment, listening, and then I took a deep breath. There it was again, the unmistakable smell of cigarette smoke. It wasn't coming from the campfire. I started walking in the direction of the smell, trying to stay quiet, but my heart was pounding in my chest. I moved slowly, staying close to the trees, trying to track the source of the smell. The smoke grew a little stronger, and soon, I could see the faint glow of a cigarette in the distance. It was about 50 yards away, maybe more. Whoever it was, they were trying to stay hidden in the shadows. I stopped dead in my tracks, trying to keep my breathing steady. I wasn't sure what I should do. Should I call out? Should I confront whoever was out there in the woods? After a few moments of hesitation, I decided to speak. "Don, is that you?" I called out, hoping to hear a familiar response, but only silence answered me. My heart skipped a beat. Whoever it was didn't want to be seen. They quickly stomped out the cigarette and hurried away into the woods, their movements quick and deliberate. I froze for a second, straining to hear anything, and then I could hear footsteps, crunching through the forest floor, moving away fast. It wasn't one of us. I couldn't tell who it was, but it definitely wasn't Don or any of us. I turned around quickly, heart racing. I had to get back to the camp. I didn't want to be out there alone, but I had to warn the others. I made my way back to the tents as quietly as possible, trying not to make a sound. I got back into my tent without anyone noticing, and I lay there in the darkness, wide awake. I didn't want to scare Emily or the others, but I had to tell them. Minutes passed before Don's voice came from outside. He had opened his tent and asked, "What's going on?" I could hear the concern in his voice. I looked at Emily, and she had woken up too. I told them what had happened, about the cigarette and how someone had been out there in the woods. Don and Sarah seemed just as confused as I was. We all sat there, unsure of what to do. Whoever had been out there wasn't part of our group. They couldn't have been. The more I thought about it, the more uneasy I became. Who would be out there at this time of night, so far from any trails or campsites? We all agreed to stay awake the rest of the night, holding whatever makeshift weapons we could find. A broken branch, a heavy rock, and an old knife from my pack. We stayed close to the fire, not daring to let it go out. Every crackle of the fire, every gust of wind, made us jump. Every little noise felt like it could be a person creeping through the woods toward us. We didn't say much, but the air was thick with tension. No one wanted to be the first to admit they were scared, but we all knew something was wrong. As the night dragged on, every sound in the woods made me more paranoid. I couldn't stop imagining that someone was watching us, waiting for the right moment to approach. The wind picked up, and the trees swayed ominously, casting long, eerie shadows. It felt like we were under siege, and no matter how hard we tried to stay calm, we couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was out there in the dark, just beyond our sight. When morning finally came, we packed up our things quickly, not wanting to linger any longer than we had to. I don't think any of us spoke much while we packed. We were all too on edge. We moved through the camp with a sense of urgency, and as soon as everything was packed up, we made our way back to the car. But before we left, we decided to check the area where I had seen the glow of the cigarette. We walked to the spot, careful not to disturb the forest floor too much, and we looked around. There was no sign of the person I had seen.
No footprints.
No evidence of anyone being there except for a handful of cigarette butts scattered on the ground. At that point, it hit me. Whoever had been out there was deliberately hiding. They had to have known we were camping nearby. They didn't just stumble across our sight. This wasn't some random person walking through the woods. This was someone who had been watching us. We didn't stick around any longer. We got in the car and left, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still out there, somewhere in the woods, watching us leave. It wasn't a ghost or some mythical creature, it was a person who had been lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to approach. And I couldn't help but wonder what they would have done if we hadn't noticed them. We never went back to that spot. And to this day, I won't go camping without a gun. I learned the hard way that the woods can hide more than just wildlife. There are people out there too, and some of them don't want to be found. I was about 10 or 12 years old when my family and I decided to go camping at a provincial park. It wasn't exactly the kind of place you'd call remote, but it wasn't crowded either. It was the tail end of summer, and the weather had been threatening to turn. A storm had been predicted, but we'd already paid for the campsite, and the trailer we were staying in was sturdy enough to handle whatever the storm could throw at us. Besides, the place wasn't all that populated. The handful of campsites around us were either empty or people were packing up and heading out. My family and I set up our camp. We had our trailer parked in a little clearing, surrounded by thick trees. There wasn't a lot of space between us and the other campers, but it was quiet, the kind of quiet that only nature can offer. By the time we were done, the sky was darkening, and the air had that sharp, electric feel to it. The first rumbles of thunder rolled across the sky, and the air was alive with tension. It was one of those storms that seemed to be waiting for something to happen, and then suddenly lightning cracked across the sky. We decided to sit outside, huddled under the awning of our trailer, watching the storm unfold. The wind had picked up, and the smell of rain was in the air, but it hadn't started raining yet. It was the perfect time to watch the lightning show. As my brother and I sat there, eyes glued to the sky, we noticed something strange. A flash of lightning cut across the sky, but instead of streaking vertically like most lightning does, this one went horizontally, from one end of the sky to the other. It was unlike anything we'd ever seen before. My brother, always the curious one, pointed it out. "Hey, what's that sideways lightning called?" he asked, voice full of wonder. We were both watching the sky, waiting for another flash to follow, when something happened that would stick with me forever. Without warning, an old woman appeared. I'm not sure where she came from. I never saw her approach, never heard any footsteps, and certainly didn't see her moving toward us. She just was there, standing behind a bush, right next to our campsite, looking at us as though she'd been standing there the whole time. She was hunched over, her clothes worn and faded, the kind of clothes you'd expect to see on someone who lived alone in the woods, disconnected from the world. Her face was lined with age, her hair white as snow and pulled back into a loose bun. She looked like someone who had spent years alone, someone who didn't care for the luxuries of modern life. But it wasn't her appearance that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was the way she spoke. "It's sheet lightning," she said, her voice raspy but clear, cutting through the air like she'd been waiting for the question. She didn't seem to care that we hadn't invited her to speak or that we hadn't even noticed her presence until just then. She turned, almost like she was moving in slow motion, and started walking away, disappearing into the trees as quickly as she had appeared. There was no fanfare, no dramatic exit. She just vanished into the darkness. My family and I sat there, stunned, trying to process what had just happened. None of us had seen her approach, and none of us had heard her speak until the moment she answered my brother's question. It didn't make sense. How long had she been standing there? Had she been watching us the whole time? Had she been waiting for someone to ask about the lightning, just so she could reveal herself? The weirdness of it all made my skin crawl. The suddenness of her appearance, the calm certainty with which she had answered my brother's question, and then her departure, it all felt wrong, like we were part of something we didn't understand, like we were being watched by someone who knew things we couldn't comprehend. We spent the rest of the evening in silence, the storm raging around us. I remember trying to shake off the feeling of unease that lingered in the air, but it was hard. Every time I looked toward the trees, every time a new flash of lightning lit up the sky, I couldn't help but think about that woman. I tried to convince myself that she was just an old camper who had wandered too far off the path, that she was nothing more than a random encounter, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. We didn't see her again, not that night or during the rest of our stay. The storm passed, the wind died down, and we were left with nothing but the crackling fire and the sound of the trees rustling in the wind. But that encounter with the old woman, with the strange way she appeared and vanished, stayed with me long after we left the park. I couldn't stop thinking about it. I couldn't understand why she had appeared when she did, why she answered my brother's question, or why she'd been standing there in the first place. Was she just a strange old woman passing through the area? Or was there something more to her than we realized? Could she have been someone who lived in the woods? Someone who had seen countless storms and had an unexplainable connection to the lightning? Or was it something even stranger than that? Something I didn't want to think about? For years after that trip, I couldn't shake the memory of that moment. Every time I thought about it, I'd get that same strange feeling, like there was something I was missing, some piece of the puzzle I couldn't quite put together. It wasn't the kind of fear that comes from ghosts or supernatural forces. It was something deeper, more unsettling. It was the fear of the unknown, the fear of something being right in front of you and still not understanding it. I've gone camping a few times since then, but I've never been able to forget that woman. The way she just appeared, the way she answered the question, and the way she disappeared into the darkness like she'd never been there at all. It's a memory that still haunts me, even to this day. So, to the sheet lightning lady, wherever you are, I'll never forget you, and I'll never stop wondering who you were, why you were there, and what it was that made you appear when you did. In 2007, I was deep in the woods, hiking the Pacific Crest Trail. It had been a long journey from the Mexico border, and by the time I reached a ridge just south of Sead Valley, the sounds of the wilderness had become a kind of second nature. The rustling of leaves, the calls of birds, the crunch of underbrush underfoot. I'd grown so accustomed to it all that I could almost predict the rhythm of the forest. I'd hiked for days without much to break the routine. The terrain was rough here, and as night began to fall, I found a small clearing on the ridge where I could set up my camp. The air was cool, but I didn't mind. The night sky stretched endlessly above, filled with stars. The peace of the moment settled over me like a blanket. But there was something different, something off about this particular night. As I unpacked my gear, I heard the familiar soft footfalls of a deer nearby. They had a knack for finding hikers, especially when we were covered in the salt from sweat or from handling our gear. At first, I didn't think much of it. It was just another deer. But then it started getting closer, too close for comfort. I glanced over my shoulder, and there it was, standing just a few feet away, its eyes wide and unblinking. The deer was scanning me, its nose twitching as it sniffed the air. It didn't seem frightened at all, and that's what bothered me. Deer usually shy away from people, but this one didn't care. I tried to shoo it away by tossing a few pine cones in its direction. The soft thud of them hitting the ground barely seemed to register. It took a step closer instead, sniffing at the gear I'd just laid out. Something about the situation felt wrong. Normally, animals like this would run off after a few gentle warnings, but this deer, just stood there unbothered, as if daring me to do something. I threw another pine cone, a little harder this time. It landed with a loud snap, but still nothing. The deer took another step forward, its nose now just inches from my pack. It was unsettling. I could feel my pulse quickening, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. This wasn't typical behavior. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the deer bolted. Its hooves clattered against the rocky ground as it sprinted toward the side of the ridge. I couldn't help but watch, confused and relieved. But that relief didn't last long. The deer's retreat was cut short by a sound I'd never forget, a blood-curdling screech that echoed through the trees. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, like a mix between a scream and a death rattle. It sounded far too desperate, far too unnatural for something as serene as a deer. I froze, unsure of what was happening. And then, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of something large running. The thud of heavy footsteps pounding against the forest floor, growing louder by the second. My heart skipped a beat. At first, I thought it was another hiker, someone trying to make up some lost miles before dark. But this wasn't the sound of someone jogging along the trail. These were loud, heavy thumps, like something huge, something dangerous was charging through the woods. I whipped my head around, straining my eyes in the dimming light. The noise came closer, the thumping now so loud I thought the source of it would be right beside me any second. But then nothing. The forest fell eerily silent for a moment. I couldn't explain it. I couldn't see anything, but the sound was unmistakable. Something was out there, something fast and powerful. My stomach twisted with dread. Then it happened. Something came barreling up the side of the ridge, moving fast, cutting across the slope like it was nothing. It didn't break a single branch or make a sound that would suggest it was dodging obstacles. It was as if the undergrowth simply parted for it, as though the forest itself was clearing the way. I could hear the rush of its movement, the air being displaced as it sprinted through the trees, the sound of its feet slamming into the earth with an unnatural speed. For a moment, I just stood there, my heart pounding in my chest. Whatever it wasn't a bear. It wasn't a wolf. It wasn't even a mountain lion. It was something else. Something far bigger, far faster, and far more unnerving than anything I'd ever encountered in over 20 years of backpacking. I didn't move, couldn't. My legs felt like lead, and my mind was racing with possibilities, none of which made sense. Whatever had just passed was moving so quickly, I couldn't get a good look at it. All I knew was that it was big, it was fast, and it was terrifying. The world around me seemed to hold its breath. My eyes scanned the trees, waiting for something to emerge, but the silence was thick, pressing in on me, making it hard to think. Time passed in that oppressive stillness, and I kept my gaze fixed on the forest, every sense alert, every hair on my body standing on edge. Half an hour later, the deer returned. Couldn't believe it. The same one. It was cautious this time, approaching the edge of the clearing but staying just outside my immediate reach. Its head was low, as though it were looking for something. seemed aware of the danger. I felt a shiver run down my spine. The deer didn't stay long. It snorted softly, glanced around nervously, and then disappeared back into the woods, its footsteps fading into the night. I still don't know what it was that I heard that night. I've been hiking for over 2 decades, and I've seen bears, wolves, and all manner of wildlife, but I've never encountered anything that made me feel the way I did that evening. The woods didn't feel the same after that, like something was watching, something out of place. I stayed up for hours, too shaken to sleep, my mind racing with thoughts of what I might have heard, what might have been lurking just out of sight. The next morning, I packed up quickly and got back on the trail. I didn't want to linger. The ridge felt haunted, like something had changed in the night, something I couldn't understand. I never told anyone about what happened, not at first. Who would believe it? What could I even say? I'd never seen anything, but I'd heard it, felt it, and I knew in my gut that whatever it wasn't something I wanted to cross paths with again. Even now, looking back on it, I can't explain what happened. All I know is that the sound of those footsteps, the speed, the silence as it passed, I'll never forget it, and I'll never feel the same in the woods again. The most stressful experience I ever had in my life happened when I was only 10 years old. I was a Boy Scout at the time, eager to be part of the group, to prove myself, and to be someone my troop could rely on. That summer, my troop went camping in the Michigan woods, a place where the trees grew tall and thick, their trunks twisting like ancient sentinels standing guard over the forest. The place felt alive, humming with energy, as if it was watching us, all of us, with eyes hidden deep within the branches and under the soil. I had grown up in a deeply religious household. My parents were devout, and religion shaped my worldview. From a young age, I had been taught the stories of God and Satan, the eternal battle between good and evil. I knew the basics. God was good, and Satan was always looking for souls to corrupt. What I didn't know, and what they had somehow left out of the teachings, was how terrifying that battle could feel when it came knocking on your door, or in my case, when it came creeping into your mind. That night, we set up camp under a dark sky, the air fresh with the smell of pine and damp earth. The crackling sound of the bonfire filled the quiet around us, and the flames danced wildly, sending their glow up into the sky, making our shadows leap and flicker around us. My fellow scouts laughed and joked, roasting marshmallows and telling ghost stories that didn't seem too real to us then, but somehow felt ominous in the way only ghost stories can when you're surrounded by nature's deep quiet. The adults sat together, their voices murmuring low over beers, the warmth of the fire keeping the cold at bay. I was in my tent, sharing it with another scout, a boy named Jeremy, who was older and always seemed too cool for me. I never could get a read on him. Some nights he'd be talkative and outgoing, and others he'd retreat into silence, as though some heavy weight had fallen on him that no one else could see. That night, though, he was asleep within minutes, his breathing slow and rhythmic. But not me. There was something about the forest that night that unsettled me. The wind was still, the trees were eerily quiet, and I felt a growing heaviness in the air. I wasn't scared at first, just unsettled. But then, as I lay there, staring at the olive green canvas of the tent, something inside me snapped. I woke up to an overwhelming sense of dread. It wasn't the kind of fear you can shake off with a quick gulp of air. It was deep, bone deep. It was the feeling you get when you know something is wrong, but you can't put your finger on it. I stared at the shadows on the tent wall, the flickering light from the campfire outside casting eerie, twisted shapes that made the shadows seem alive. At first, I tried to dismiss it. After all, I was just a kid with a wild imagination, right? But then it happened. The shadows, the flickering shapes, they began to move on their own. They were no longer just shadows of the trees or the fire. They were something else, The shapes began to twist, to contort into something more sinister. My heart began to pound in my chest as I watched them. The shadows, which I had previously thought were harmless, began to take on the shape of a skull, long, drawn out, and hollow, with empty sockets where eyes should be. The image burned into my mind. The firelight danced, and for a moment, it felt like the shadows were staring back at me. The skull seemed to grin at me, its jagged teeth sharp, its empty eyes fixed on my soul. I could feel a cold sweat bead on my forehead. I could feel my hands tremble as I clutched the edge of my sleeping bag. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, pounding louder with every passing second. My breathing grew shallow, and I tried to move, to turn away from the sight, but my body wouldn't obey. I was frozen, trapped in my own mind. The room grew smaller, and the shadows closed in around me, their eyes burning through the walls of the tent. I thought I could hear something, a whisper, soft at first, barely audible, but then growing louder. It was like a voice was speaking directly to me. No, not speaking, more like calling. The voice was deep, cold, and seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing in my skull. "You're not safe here," it said, the words cutting through the air like ice. My chest tightened, and for a moment, I felt like I was going to suffocate. I was terrified. The rational part of me told me it was just my mind playing tricks, that the shadows were just that, shadows. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I could feel the air around me growing colder, as if the temperature had dropped suddenly and sharply. I don't know how long I lay there, paralyzed with fear, staring at the skull-like figure in the shadows. It felt like hours, but it was probably only minutes. Every second felt like an eternity. The voice, the whispers, they continued, a constant pressure on my mind, urging me to give in, to let go. I could feel something pulling at me, like invisible hands wrapped around my chest, squeezing tighter and tighter. It felt like the darkness was trying to drag me under, like it was reaching out to swallow me whole. And then, just as the darkness seemed to close in around me completely, something broke through. A sudden warmth spread through my body, like the sun breaking through clouds on a cold day. It wasn't much, but it was enough. It was like the spell had broken, like the grip on my chest had loosened. I don't know what made me do it. I don't know what gave me the strength, but I bolted upright, tearing myself out of the sleeping bag in a panic. My legs felt weak, but I didn't care. I shot out of the tent, running as fast as I could into the night, not caring that the cold air bit at my skin, not caring that I wasn't properly dressed for the rush. Couldn't stop. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the tears starting to well up in my eyes. I could still feel the presence of something behind me, just out of reach, but always there, waiting. My feet pounded against the earth as I ran toward the light, the campfire that was still burning in the center of the campsite. I didn't look back, couldn't, but I could hear the rustle of leaves behind me, like something was moving in the dark. The sound seemed to follow me, just at the edge of my hearing, as though something was watching me. I could feel its eyes on my back, like it was waiting for me to stumble, waiting for me to stop running. Finally, I burst into the clearing, where the adults sat around the fire. They looked up at me, startled, as I fell to my knees in front of them, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Tears streamed down my face, and I could feel the wetness of urine trickling down my leg. "Are you okay?" one of the adults asked, his voice laced with concern. I couldn't answer. I was shaking too much. I could barely breathe, but I didn't care. I was safe. I was no longer in the tent, no longer in that suffocating darkness. I had escaped whatever it was that had been lurking in the shadows. The next morning, when I went to chapel with the other scouts, I felt different. It wasn't just the fact that I had made it through the night. I had faced something that I couldn't quite explain, but I was alive. I had survived. I felt an overwhelming gratitude for that, a deep appreciation for the safety that the light had provided. That morning, I prayed harder than I ever had before. I thanked God for bringing me through that night, for protecting me from whatever evil had been lurking in the woods. I didn't know what it had been, but I knew one thing for certain. It was real. The fear, the terror, the feeling that something was coming for me. It had all been real. And for the first time in my life, I understood. I understood the importance of that cosmic battle. I understood the weight of my soul, and I understood why it mattered. As the days passed and we packed up camp to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, watching, waiting. But I was no longer afraid. I had been through it and I had come out the other side. Maybe I wasn't the same as I had been before. Maybe I'd never look at the woods the same way again. But I had grown up that night in ways I couldn't fully understand yet. I had learned something I would carry with me for the rest of my life. Sometimes the scariest things aren't the ones you can see. They're the ones you feel deep in your gut, lurking in the darkness. And that's why, even to this day, when I go camping, I make sure to keep the fire burning, because sometimes that's all that keeps the darkness at bay. It's been years since that camping trip, but I still can't get the events of that night out of my head. The memories are vivid, especially the way everything felt so normal at first, how the guy seemed so harmless. The whole thing still bothers me, and I've often wondered if maybe I imagined the whole thing, or if my brain had just made it up as a defense mechanism. But the more I think about it, the clearer the details get. Too clear to be a product of my mind trying to protect itself. It was a typical camping trip for us, something we did every year. Kearney, Ontario was our spot. It was remote, quiet, and perfect for a group of friends looking to escape the noise of city life. We always set up our tents in a big circle with the fire pit right in the center. There was something comforting about how we arranged ourselves, as if the circle represented safety and unity. The fire in the middle symbolized warmth, both literal and figurative, bringing us all together after a long day of hiking, eating, and laughing. This time, the trip felt like any other. We'd been camping here for years, and nothing had ever gone wrong. We were a tight-knit group of friends, all of us into nature, hiking, and, admittedly, getting a little wild when the mood struck. On this particular night, a few of us were drinking, others were smoking joints, and some of us were tripping on shrooms. It was a late summer evening, the temperature just right for sitting around the fire, chatting, and passing around drinks and snacks. The fire crackled in front of us, casting long shadows against the trees. The night had settled in, the air growing cooler, and the only sounds were the occasional crack of a twig, the rustle of the wind, and the chatter of our group. We had been out there for a few hours, just enjoying the peace of the woods. The stars above were bright and clear, the kind of night that made you feel small but in a good way, like you were part of something bigger. Then he showed up. We didn't see him coming. One moment we were all focused on the fire, and the next a guy was standing in the circle with us. He wasn't tall, but he wasn't short either. His clothes were simple, just a t-shirt and jeans, nothing too special. But there was something about the way he appeared, as if he had just materialized out of the woods. He introduced himself, though I can't remember his name now. He said he was in the military and had decided to take a little vacation, to get away from it all and do some camping on his own. He asked if he could join us by the fire, since it was getting late and he didn't have any firewood of his own. The whole situation seemed weird, but none of us thought much of it at the time. We were all stoned, just enjoying the buzz, so it felt natural to let him join. He was friendly enough, pitched in a little money for the firewood, and we settled back into our relaxed state. The night wore on, and the conversation drifted from one topic to another. We joked, told stories, and laughed, the fire crackling louder with every log we threw on it. People started to head off to their tents one by one. I think I was one of the earlier ones to go, either second or third, I don't remember for sure. It didn't matter much at the time. We had all been up for hours, and the combination of the alcohol, weed, and shrooms was making me feel drowsy. The next thing I knew, I was inside my tent, wrapped in my sleeping bag, trying to settle into sleep. But then, something woke me up. It was the sound of talking. Low, muffled, but definitely talking. And there was something else, something odd. The fire was still going, casting flickering light through the thin walls of my tent. I checked my phone. It was 4 a.m. At first, I thought maybe one of my friends had gotten up, maybe to stoke the fire or go for a piss. But when I peeked out of my tent, I saw him, the guy who had joined us earlier. He was sitting on a log by the fire, completely alone, and talking to himself. It's hard to describe the feeling, but it was like everything in me told me something was off. The way he was sitting there, so still and focused, his voice so quiet but constant, as if he was having a conversation with someone invisible, it didn't sit right. I was still tripping on shrooms, so I couldn't tell if I was just seeing things or if it was real. But the more I watched him, the more I realized that something wasn't normal. He wasn't just sitting there in the glow of the fire, chatting idly. He was intense, like he was waiting for something, but I was in no condition to deal with it. My mind was foggy, and the warmth of my sleeping bag felt too good to get out and confront him. I convinced myself it was just the drugs playing tricks on me, that my brain was making something out of nothing. I closed my eyes, tried to drift back to sleep, and forced the whole thing out of my mind. The next morning, when I woke up, the first thing I noticed was the fire. It was smoldering, just the remnants of what had been a roaring blaze the night before. The air was fresh, but there was a slight chill in the morning. As I crawled out of my tent, I saw the rest of the group stirring. We all greeted each other, relieved that everyone was still there, still alive. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but when we looked over to the next campsite, the one where the guy had said he was staying, it was strange. There was no sign of him, not even a trace that anyone had been there. The ground was undisturbed, no tracks leading to or from the site, no leftover trash or evidence of a campfire. It was as if the guy had never been there at all. We started talking about him, making sure we had all seen the same thing. One by one, we pieced together the timeline. The last two of our group had passed out just after 3:30 a.m. The first person had woken up just after 6 a.m., and the guy was gone. We couldn't find any explanation for it. No one had seen him leave, and there were no signs that he'd packed up and moved on quietly in the night. The rest of the camping trip went without incident. We finished up the weekend and went back to our lives. But the memory of that night, that guy, stayed with me. It nagged at me, something about it felt wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that we had been watched, or worse, that we had let someone in who shouldn't have been there. Fast forward about 4 or 5 years. I was flipping through the news one evening, half paying attention to the headlines. But then a mugshot caught my eye. It was a photo of a man who looked familiar. My stomach dropped. The face was the same one I remembered from that night by the fire. The guy who had joined us in the circle. The guy who had sat by the fire alone, talking to himself. I couldn't be sure. It had been years, and I didn't have any photos of the guy to compare it to. But something about the way his eyes looked, the shape of his face, it all felt like a gut punch. The article said he had been arrested for a series of crimes, including rape and murder. Couldn't believe it. How could the friendly guy who had casually joined us around the fire turn out to be someone so dangerous? Maybe it wasn't him. Maybe it was just someone who looked like him, but deep down, I knew that face. My brain had stored it away, filed it like an image in a folder, ready to be recalled when I saw it again. And when I did, it was like all the pieces of that night clicked together in a horrifying way. I still think about it sometimes, about what might have happened if we had confronted him, if we had just asked more questions or been more cautious. But we were young, carefree, and trusting. We didn't see the danger until it was too late, if it ever was. We may never know for sure, but every time I think back to that trip, I can't help but wonder if we narrowly escaped something far worse. That's the scariest part, isn't it? Not knowing if we were just lucky, or if something far darker had been lurking out there in the woods that night.